Thanks for tuning in to another show in the next Reel family of film podcasts.
Want to skip those ads and get early access?
Become a member at truestory.fm/join and discover all the other great perks that come with it. Welcome to CinemaScope. I'm Andy Nelson. Each episode, we map one genre, subgenre, or film movement, what defines it, what shaped it, and what it influenced. Today, we're turning inward. We've been tracing how post-war anxiety moves through Hollywood genre by genre, from moral crisis on the Western frontier to Cold War dread externalized as invasion and mutation in science fiction, to the urban shadows and fatalism of film noir. This episode takes that same pressure and brings it home, literally. We're looking at post-war domestic melodrama, what Hollywood used to call the women's picture, and what some of the most formally inventive filmmakers of the era turned into a genuine mode of social critique. These films don't externalize anxiety. They trap it inside the house, inside the marriage, inside the gaze of neighbors and the weight of respectability. The threat isn't a monster or a bomb or a crime. It's the home itself, functioning as a system of control. We're going to move through 10 films chronologically, 5 on the main show and 5 more in the extended discussion for members. Joining me is Patricia White, Centennial Chair and Professor of Film and Media Studies at Swarthmore College, where she also coordinates the Gender and Sexuality Studies program. She's the author of Uninvited, Classic Hollywood Cinema and Lesbian Representability, and a BFI Classic on Rebecca. Patricia, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Andy.
I am thrilled to have you joining me here today to talk about this period of film, these post-war domestic melodramas, as Hollywood kind of pejoratively used to call women's pictures.
Yeah.
Before we really kick in and dig into all of this, I'd love to know, what is your history with this cycle, or what kind of draws you to it?
Oh, that's exciting. Yeah, I've always been a fan of what I didn't know was called the women's picture. And that was a bit anachronistic because it's my mother's generation of movies. But I loved Bette Davis and Barbara Stanwyck. I loved Joan Fontaine. So I loved certain movies that were in circulation on broadcast TV, probably terrible prints on weird channels. And I always was drawn to those. And then I was fortunate enough to go to college at the moment of sort of the rediscovery of the women's picture. So I was instantly drawn to the classes that represented my overlapping interests. So I took women's studies and I took film studies. And the women's studies that I was looking at was not really taking these works seriously because so many of them are very much about what you can do with women's powerlessness, right? Which is a lot, it turns out. But the film classes were really highlighting the sort of explosion of interest in the melodrama, I'd say, as almost an overarching category for Hollywood film, right? I mean, almost all classical Hollywood is drama told through music as well as other things. But the melos, was pretty heavy duty, like really heavily romantic music scores telling you what to feel in pretty much any mode of filmmaking. And then the newspapers called many things melodramas that, we today would not call melodramas. Oh, this is a crime melodrama. This is a whatever. But what was happening in the scholarship, and this was really, I think, the heyday of film studies kind of coming into the academy and saying, let's take previously kind of low culture forms seriously. And that was the movies in general, maybe in the 70s. But by the 80s, that was the trivialized movies like the women's picture, right? So now while some women's pictures like Gone with the Wind, have the respect of multiple Oscars and, huge box office, a lot of the films that were being kind of taken up, and this is by both male critics who were really auteurist and kind of mise-en-scène oriented, and an emerging feminist cadre of critics who were interested in, say, the source material or the stars or the actual history of what was happening around gender in the 40s and 50s. And most of these critics were either British or American. So in those countries, they were all kind of converging around a reevaluation of melodrama and thinking of it as maybe one of the ways that Hollywood did what it did best, which is take kind of a small scale. And if you think of like that square, which is the screen, and think of it as like a window into like a domestic space, and tell a story in a really condensed period of time. Fortunately, most movies then were shorter than they now, in a pretty bounded space, and that was about characters, and that were about characters who were iconic in some way because they were played by stars. So they had baggage of what the star brought. All of that kind of focused energy and sort of intensity kind of was there in the melodrama. And that just was like a field day for critics. So I was super excited to take a melodrama class that spanned, whatever, D.W. Griffith, of course, to contemporary soap operas. And there still were a lot of daytime soap operas in the 70s. And some of them, I'm thinking of like Barbara Rush, some of them had actors in them who had played in 40s and 50s women's pictures, right?
Gotcha.
There's a real continuity of a storytelling form that had always been sort of aimed at women, but periodically tried to be kind of lifted up into sort of general interest, kind of the general interest in the post-war period. We'll get into it, like by the 50s was like sex or, secrets, or would get lifted up into general interest because, oh my God, Jean-Luc Godard thinks that Nicholas Ray is an axiom of the cinema, is cinema.
Yeah.
They would periodically be lifted up as something that was worthy of study. And that tension between their popularity and their kind of triviality or lowbrow status, but also kind of well-knownness, like you could kind of say Stella Dallas and you'd, know that meant maternal sacrifice and that had some significance even for like the women's movement, that there was some intensity there. And that had this kind of critical attention that was pretty avid. That was just very intoxicating, right? You could love these movies on the emotional level. You could expand on them on the intellectual level. So that's, I guess, what we're going to do today.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this is going to be a great conversation. I'm looking forward to digging into this. Just so people know, we're going to be moving chronologically through 10 films, some on the main show, and then we're going to save 5 for the members. The films we're looking at: from 1945, Mildred Pierce. Also 1945, Leave Her to Heaven. 1949, The Reckless Moment. 1952, The Bad and the Beautiful. 1955, All That Heaven Allows. 1956, Written on the Wind. Also 1956, Bigger Than Life. 1959, Imitation of Life. 1960, Home from the Hill. And 1961, The Children's Hour. If you'd like to access the member content, you can join for $5 a month or $55 a year. Just head to truestory.fm/join. That's truestory.fm/join to learn more. Before we really dig in, I want to kind of like macroscopically just figure out like, why is this important to talk about? And to get us there, before we do that, I really want to figure out and talk to you about the distinction between drama and melodrama and why they operate differently. I found this quote from Sidney Lumet in Making Movies, his book, that says, "In drama, the characters should determine the story. In melodrama, the story determines the characters." And then he also went on to say, "Melodrama is a much maligned genre. I always think of melodrama as the thing we are all capable of that's swept under the rug." So there's a lot, I think, in there as to what he's saying about the emotion. And I don't know, is it at the expense of realism? Like, what are we looking at when we say drama, melodrama?
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction. And, I'll go back to saying that the melos in the drama, the music, is sort of generally speaking pervasive. It's cueing feeling. And so emotion, which can have a lot of realism in it, is predominating over sort of, drama in the sense of like an Aristotelian drama of, there's going to be a tragedy and a downfall, or even like a crime drama in which it's driven by plot, right? You're entering a space in which, and I'll generalize the melos, the music, to all the expressive elements of cinema that are included in like mise en scène. So, the decor, the blocking, the costumes, the jewelry, the things that, again, as Lumet said, you kind of want to pretend aren't important, but you cannot sweep them under the rug because they are so determinative of how you're responding. So drama, maybe characters, I'm not recalling the quote specifically.
In drama, the characters should determine the story. In melodrama, the story determines the characters.
Right. And so those characters are pre-given. I mean, it's not like commedia dell'arte in that way, that there's the victim, there's the villain. If you go back to real, silent melodrama or stage melodrama, there's an instant recognizability to the character, and it's not about their interiority, even though it might be about their emotion. It's not about their psychological problems, although all of these films that we're going to talk about are pervaded by pop psychology, Freudian psychology as it entered, the US big time in this period. They're representing emotional states, or they're representing iconic positions like the mother, the father, the social outcast, the juvenile delinquent. So the drama determines the characters in the sense that they don't really have control over their fate, right? And that's kind of what we're getting into. We're getting into this kind of witnessing of chance, coincidence, sometimes pretty major action, even though we're looking at mostly domestic melodramas that are confined spatially, and that these things we're more witnesses to what happens to these characters than like getting inside their heads and figuring out like what we would do if we were them. It's almost like we're like watching the whole thing, like, right?
Right.
So we're all capable of it, if that's what Lumet said. Indeed, the common sense version of melodrama is like overacting or exaggerating or reliance on coincidence or the last minute rescue or the, arriving too late, all of those things. They have their, as I said before, emotional realism insofar as the sense of helplessness or righteousness that many of these characters feel are really kind of primal reasons for like engaging in, spectatorship, any kind of entertainment. We want to see these archetypal characters and events. So, yeah. And then it is maligned, and it's maligned because it's associated with women and with the powerless. And that, I think, is the other big insight, which is that stories about the powerless are universal because we really don't have power over our fates. And so if we could destigmatize that association, then like the female character or the sort of racially marginalized character that we might see in like later melodramas or social problem films, those are situations that socially are not unrealistic, but that we're kind of making the position universal. And it's not something we want to do. We don't want to say we're victims.
Right. And I think that's interesting because the way I'm hearing that is that they each have their place. Drama can do some things that melodrama can't, but melodrama can do some things that drama can't. And looking at the excess and the feelings like that come spilling out, right? Like the internal of those stories. And I think it's very important. And I think there's absolutely a place for it.
In the dark, especially.
Right. Exactly. Well, and in the dark, and I wanted to bring this up too, because I think just talking about the importance of this, especially as we're looking at post-war domestic melodramas, I think that there's definitely a conversation to be had about that connection to film noir, which is, I just talked about that last month, and how there's a lot of the same underlying pressures in these stories. There's also a sense that desire is dangerous, right? We see a lot of, and the first few films we're going to be talking about definitely are overlapping those two genres.
Absolutely.
I want to move into the origins, and I want to kind of talk about like where all of this starts, right? You mentioned earlier things like Stella Dallas and films that were earlier that are certainly what we would call the domestic melodrama, but at what point does it become post-war domestic melodrama? And like, it didn't just start in 1945 with Mildred Pierce. Like, there's roots that we're going to be looking at. And so I'm curious about, with the domestic melodramas that had already been established in the 30s and 40s, and even earlier, going, as you said, all the way back to
silent era, yeah.
To the silent era, absolutely.
Or to the 19th century, if you read stage
novels. I think there's a lot of places where we're getting a lot of these types of stories. How did Hollywood tap into what the audience wanted to start developing these stories?
I think the designation post-war is really important. I think we went back and forth a little bit. Does that mean 50s or 40s?
Yeah.
And I really like that we hit 45, which is, the moment, the end of the war. So the women's picture, I think, in the scholarship at least, is considered to be already very dominant in the 1930s. And then in the 40s, to answer your question about why the industry was, so hot to go there, was because the audience was predominantly female during the war, because men were at least perceived to be overseas fighting the war. So the upswing in films aimed shamelessly at women's audiences and starring female stars who were not necessarily like glamorously beautiful, like Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, was in part an economic decision. And a lot of those 1940s films aimed at the domestic audience in the sense of, not abroad, because those women were in fact not particularly domestic during that time. They're working in war plants, right? The films that were aimed at them tended to be even more about the central female character and the paradoxes, as I kind of mentioned before, of her passivity and powerlessness, even as she's commanding this, incredible emotional, I'm thinking of like Bette Davis pretending that she can see, even though she's going blind, in order so that her husband doesn't know, in Dark Victory. Even a title like Dark Victory, it's like the things that are held in tension there are crazy. So I absolutely adore 1940s melodramas. And I do think that they were more directed towards women's audiences. So what we see in this shift to this post-war is a sense of both, did we empower women too much by moving them into the workforce? And that's both white women in the war industry and Black women maybe moving them into the war effort because they're already in the workforce. Did we empower them too much? And now we have to teach them some lessons, and we'll teach them the lessons in these melodrama, these very paradoxical dark victories that are happening always in these films, where like the woman is like done all this stuff and then she's like, oh, all I really wanted was to get married to this
That's
guy
right.
at the end, and you're like, okay, right.
Yeah. Yeah, the redomestication, I think, is such an interesting part of all of this.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your help. And now go back to the house. Right.
Exactly. And so the shift really has tensions at this point. And that's when in the scholarship, they started being called family melodramas, or as we get into the 50s, they're about Eisenhower America and the contradictions of the family under post-war capitalism and social conformity, moving to the suburbs, having this life with the car and the picture window where everyone could, look into your home as if it were a movie screen and probably see your television in there. Travel, all of the sort of spectacular elements that we start to see, Technicolor, widescreen, exotic locations, really amping up domestic decor. I'm sorry, I am a film geek, so I have to say that during the 30s, when there's a depression, we also have an amping up of domestic decor, like with these incredible Art Deco interiors that no one could afford, but that's why you went to the movies, because you saw them there.
Yeah.
So you have this shift towards an audience that's understood to be, maybe led by the decision of the woman who picked the movie, but not exclusively female. And the protagonists are by no means, in the set of films that we're going to look at, like the soldiering on woman. There's all kinds of pathologies that come up in the family. So we have these paternal pathologies. We have the problem of youth that's going to go astray. And we have all this popular sociology coming out, like Organization Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, this book called Generation of Vipers that blames moms for the sapping of the energy of the American male. Like, these books are being read by the screenwriters, and they're kind of popping up in some of the pop psychology. So it's a really troubled period in terms of, what messages we want from, what the American family should be. And it's also a troubled period, as, any film historian will say, in terms of the studio system, right? So we start out with movies, made during a year when everyone's going to the movies, like 1946, and we end up in 1961 where we're like, oh my God, I think we're going to have to do something. We've already had the divestment of the studios of their movie theaters, but we're also going to finally have to do something about this production code and let something more adult come into the movies, because we have a Supreme Court decision about the movie should actually be treated as protected speech and be able to. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of contradiction, and that happens in the movies, each of these movies too.
Yeah. And I think, just other things that I've been thinking about, I think the women coming home, but also there's just a boom of suburbs, right? Of the whole space with the GI Bill, and looking at places like Levittown, which is kind of like the cookie cutter style that we'll kind of see as these homes become like the American dream. And also we're looking at the kind of that whole ideology of containment with the fear of communism and everything that's been going, and starting to do more policing with gender and sexuality and normalcy. We'll just put in quotes.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff with all of this. And then as you mentioned, TV is kicking off.
Speaking of containment, taking this big widescreen thing, and at least two of these movies have two of the best television takedown.
Yeah, one of the most iconic TV shots in film is in one of these films. Absolutely.
And two of them actually, both bigger than life. Maybe that's bonus content. And All That Heaven Allows have the best TV scenes.
Yeah. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. So one thing I like to talk about is where these things fit in the cinematic family tree. This kind of fits, I don't know. I guess I'm curious, where do you stand with this? Are we calling this a genre, a subgenre, a cycle, a mood? What is the post-war domestic melodrama? Let's start there.
I think I'm going to, be a scholar for a minute and, say that there's so much debate about melodrama. And no, it's not a genre. So melodrama is a mode. I mean, we've already kind of talked about like it's a mode of storytelling that happens through things other than the drama itself, right? It's less about the script and more about the affective, expressive elements. But I would say that there's a cycle. I don't know that the 10 films that we are going to talk about are all sort of in the same cycle. But I do think, and this might be, again, the influence of auteurist critics on me, but the idea of a sort of family melodrama or domestic melodrama that's distinctively post-war, that includes Technicolor films by Nick Ray, Vincente Minnelli, and most notably Douglas Sirk, is a cycle. I mean, there's definitely a sense in an economic way that people are, at studio folks are saying, this is working, let's do more of it. And that's a cycle. So I think I would put it there.
Yeah. I think you could almost see like the different genres that we're tapping into in that mode or the cycle. Like there's a maternal melodrama with things like Mildred Pierce and Imitation of Life, suburban containment stories, masculine domestic crisis in a couple of our stories.
Male weepies. Male melodramas.
Right. Yeah. Some gothic desire, coded desire, we certainly are going to talk about. We also have an industry melodrama, which will be an interesting one to throw into the mix. So I think that it's certainly fascinating. How would you say that it evolved over this period of time? Because, I mean, obviously, what we're looking at does kind of come to an end, like right about The Children's Hour, our last film we're talking about, 1961, where things kind of shift into more of a look at kind of like social issues and become like the social issues film. So from like the beginning of like the post-war cycle to the end, like, do you see an evolution?
Amongst the films that we're going to talk about, yes, I think we go from some of the traditional women's picture concerns to, bigger canvas, both literally in terms of widescreen and like these kind of social problem things. And the 60s are kind of, I think the social problem films that Children's Hour represents started in the 40s too, right? So those are all, so in some ways, I wouldn't use that as an endpoint. We have late films like Home from the Hill, and I guess we have a lot of just carryover into television. So there's not really an end to the domestic melodrama. Some of these, like Peyton Place, which was on our original list, becomes, one of the most important. So,
boy, did that go on forever.
Yeah. In the 60s, precisely the 60s. But we do have a sense that old Hollywood is kind of dead by, you have Sound of Music in 1964, but then you have Bonnie and Clyde in 1967. So you have a sense that these are kind of dying with old Hollywood. So like late melodrama is kind of like late noir, where there's just these internal things showing up and becoming more and more out of control, kind of preparing the ground for the upsurge that will be New Hollywood. And we don't need the coded sex of the domestic melodramas when we get a serious influx of foreign films, which is happening during this period, and there's explicit sex in those. I guess cinema appreciation is also happening around that time. So you start to get, cage cinema, like discovering all these auteurs, that getting translated into the US, the look for new directors. So I guess there's just a long transition period from, the sort of mid 50s to the mid 60s, where some of the juiciest, weirdest movies are made, not only in domestic melodramas, but noir, etc.
Across the board,
why is the need for it over? I think a lot of things. And we're like High and Red Scare. We have a film like Johnny Guitar that's not on our list because it's a Western, but it's also.
And I did talk about that in my post-war Westerns conversation.
Okay, great. So you have, and that's Nick Ray, and it's kind of resembling in some ways the same. I mean, there's the desire problem and the decor kind of taking over. So you have I guess the question is there an evolution, maybe devolution into, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like how I look at it, because I mean, in the beginning, it definitely feels like very noirish. Like we're seeing a lot of the kind of the darkness and really kind of that post-war readjustment, and everybody's kind of like this more psychological dread sort of weighing into those, and then it kind of explodes, as you already said, with the cinemascope and the Technicolor and just the beautiful widescreen interiors that we're getting and the outfits and everything. And then it seems like with the collapse of the production code and how we start seeing it cracking and everything, I don't know, I guess the way that I would look at it is there's kind of a mutation of the post-war, specifically the post-war domestic melodrama, that kind of shifts into more social problem films, the new Hollywood, and specifically the TV soap operas. I think that's really kind of where we end up seeing it go.
Yeah. And I think the TV soap operas that are on screen, like if you think even of the like ways that, I don't know, the other, like the Rock Hudson, Doris Day comedy, sex comedies, there's an adjacency to that kind of TV ready, banter oriented. And, you have like Peyton Place, like some of them are made in the 60s of these, the end game.
Plus Douglas Sirk leaves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we'll just call that the real marker.
I think,
of the end of all this.
I think the funeral at the end of Imitation of Life kind of is probably, in some ways, the death knell of a certain kind of Hollywood, both sophistication and profligacy in terms of emotion and a certain kind of production value spending, and it's a good place to end.
Yeah, right. Very, very fitting. All right. Well, before we get into the films, just a quick note again for listeners who want to go deeper. The conversation you're going to be hearing today is the public episode, 5 films, a full exploration of the cycle. But Patricia and I are actually discussing 10 films total. The 5 you won't hear today, Leave Her to Heaven, The Bad and the Beautiful, Written on the Wind, Imitation of Life, and The Children's Hour, are part of the extended member discussion. And honestly, they're going to be rich conversations. So if you want to access those and every other member bonus episode, you can join for $5 a month or $55 a year at truestory.fm/join. Check it out. We'll be right back. All right, you ready to start digging into some of these movies?
Yes.
All right, we're going to start with Mildred Pierce from 1945, directed by Michael Curtiz. Mildred Pierce is a divorcee who builds a successful restaurant business from nothing to provide for her daughters, particularly her cold, ambitious daughter, Veda. The film frames her story as a noir mystery, opening with a murder and a police interrogation before flashing back to show how Mildred got there. This is, we're kind of looking at this as kind of the origin point for our conversation. We've got maternal ambition, we've got class aspiration, the home as kind of an economy. Everything here that we're talking about is all wrapped in this noir of a woman put on trial, essentially from the first frame of the movie. And I think that's a great place to start, is this noir wrapper for this that we're looking at, right? There's a flashback. We've got this murder mystery going on. She's a suspect before we even know her story. And Joan Crawford, I mean, come on, she is such a star in this movie. And having talked about her in Sudden Fear in the noir conversation last time, I mean, she's a powerhouse of a performer. And this was kind of a reinvention for her, because she had kind of been written off by Hollywood up to this point, right? Yeah.
No, everything was riding on this film for her. So Warner Brothers film. So, black and white, made with the kind of tightness of the reins around, like, how it's going to look. It's not the lavishness of the other things that we're going to see. And that wraparound is an add-on, right? It's an add-on to both the James M. Cain novel, which comes out in the 30s, and is about the Depression. And the movie feels like a Depression era. There's a Depression era ethos in it. And Joan Crawford starred in so many of those Depression era women's pictures. So there's this kind of interesting throwback to that. But the first script for the film followed, the book, and they were sent back to put this kind of noir wraparound on it. It's sort of a self-indulgent thing for me to say. But I do want to say that there are noirish elements in women's pictures from the beginning of the 40s. And I would start with Rebecca there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's a whole cycle of, the way they're lit. Some of the themes are kind of infiltrating women's pictures proper. And there's, I guess, crime in that. But this one, turning it into we have the crime investigation paralleling the story, and we get flashbacks narrated, but not fully, by Mildred Pierce telling the story, makes this very firmly at least passed off as a film noir. So one of the big contradictions is that film noirs don't generally even go into people's houses. Like, they go into their apartments, their, special, whatever, LA bungalows. Like, domesticity and domestic roles are usually excluded from the noir world, which is a nighttime world. So Mildred Pierce is in many parts of it, very much a daytime film. So how does that work? Well, that's, catnip for the feminist critic, right? Because you're like, you said it, what is her crime? And her crime, is loving her daughter too much. She has two daughters, one of whom is a, tomboy, actually, good-natured kid who conveniently dies, so that the exclusive relationship between Mildred Pierce and her walked off the set of a film noir daughter, Veda, can be really at the focus of the script. So there's some continuity there between sort of the over closeness of Stella Dallas and her daughter that's so, overpowering that she has to send her daughter away because her class background presents issues for her daughter's capacity to rise socially, which again is a 30s Depression era narrative. So what do we do in this moment so I think it's important that Mildred Pierce is kind of shot during the war. Like, it is a wartime film. It's legitimately let's make a women's picture, maternal melodrama, but it doesn't get released until, people are coming back. So what should that look like? And its relationship to the war is very strange. Like, there's references to not having stockings, or the man shortage, which leaves us with all of these cads and losers that make it impossible for all the labor, all the decision making, all of the earning, all of the screen time really is for the women. So it's very contradictory that way.
Well, and there's an interesting element with Mildred also that I think, this again is post-war, and she's a worker. She's a businesswoman. She starts up her own business, and the film frames it as something that she's a success. It's an achievement, but also it feels like there's a little bit of a transgression, the way that the Veda sees it. It's like, you're not giving me what I need. You need to be married to somebody who has all this money, and that's the only way that you can actually have really provided for me.
Yeah, we're getting a really punishing for her career ambition. So you can't both be a mother and a career woman, and your maternity. And that is the book that I referenced before, Generation of Vipers, I think is really important here, because there is a pathologizing of Mildred's affection for Vida and her ambitions for her. So, and the daughter has a weird notion of class. So she's very, her mother smells of grease. Her mother's business is not, cosmetics, which is where some of the earliest women entrepreneurs, both black and white, kind of made their fortunes. It's domestic. It's cooking fried chicken, chicken and waffles joints all up and down the coast. When the neon is great. And you mentioned the cookie cutter homes. Her husband originally was kind of a real estate guy. He's not very effective. The first restaurant that Mildred takes over is in a model home, right? Or at least in the book it is, and I don't know how explicit it is, but it's like the idea that there's a kind of, what we call it the second shift, like women who work and then, go home and still work. This is also women who cook and then go to work and still cook. So Mildred isn't sufficiently consumerist. And her daughter wants the magic of post-war consumerism where you don't see the labor to happen. And you mentioned Joan Crawford. She did win the Oscar for it. She, kind of was so worried she wouldn't that she didn't go. So she had to get it. Very drama there. But, you must have said this in Sudden Fear. Like, she is not the subtlest actress.
Oh, yeah.
And a critic who writes about fashion and how important fashion is in women's pictures and in these domestic melodramas, talks about the sort of first introduction to Mildred where she's wearing this enormous fur coat with these enormous shoulder pads that has such a tactility to it that she's like, the coat is where the feeling is. Like the tactility of the coat is the feeling, because Mildred's face, Joan Crawford's face, is like, blank. That's kind of an aside, but I think it's her performance and the kind of, it becomes for us retroactively such an important film because of the revelations around Joan Crawford's own parenting, and the way that she's played in Mommy Dearest by Faye Dunaway, that just show her as being kind of a monstrous mother. So I think the film is very sympathetic to Mildred, and to go back to the fact that she does get to narrate her own story. I mean, it starts, I feels like I was born in a kitchen, right? That's a funny thing to say to the detective investigating the murder of your, no good second husband, right? So the film goes back and forth between putting us in this place where we are deeply empathic with Mildred and her female friendship, and also sort of judging of her excesses and bad decisions. I mean, don't marry that Monty guy,
Right. Some
maybe
clear
don't
signs.
wear that swimsuit. I mean, swim cap.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. So how, with the way fitting into this post-war domestic melodrama mode, how do you view the ending? Do you view that it punishes her, or does it return her to is it a defeated freedom?
I don't think she's free. I'll mention Race, which is pretty underground. I mean, and it's a kind of paradoxical that Walter White and the campaign to make Hollywood, to part of the NAACP, to make Hollywood, not have such stereotypical representations of African Americans based on their contributions to the war, has the ironic effect of, basically having no Black people in many of these movies. But so I'm circling back to your question about the end, which is that we have her literally kind of walking into the dawn, remarried to a man that she seems to have very little affinity with, or, getting back with her first husband, and white women cleaning the floor of the courthouse. So we have this no, I think she's free in relationship to her class, maybe, even though she might have lost all her money too, and is returned to kind of a domesticity. Vita's exit is my favorite, where she says, don't worry, I'll get by. She's off to women's prison. So that, I want to see that movie.
Right.
But there are some tensions in the movie between working women and working class women around race. And so Butterfly McQueen, who's unforgettable anytime she's on screen, is sort of hired to, help Mildred, and at certain points feels like they could do some of this work together, but at Vita's insistence, Butterfly McQueen becomes a status symbol, becomes a kind of reinscription of hierarchies of what kinds of acceptable womanhood there is during this period. So the ending of the film, by reminding us that there are working women, these women scrubbing, and maybe perhaps even reminding us of other working women of color, et cetera, or has a contradiction. But I think it's definitely, I feel like it's Molly Haskell in From Reverence to Rape, who calls it like the step down, the last 5 minutes of the woman's picture where like everything we've seen is erased, but it's also easy to forget it, kind of. I mean, it's easy to remember the 85 minutes before.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. Let's shift to our next film, The Reckless Moment, 1949, directed by Max Ophüls. This film takes the domestic space and strips away almost everything else. No murder mystery frame, no gothic excess, just a woman, a house, and everything she has to do to hold it together. Lucia Harper is a suburban housewife in California whose teenage daughter becomes entangled with a shady older man. When the man turns up dead, Lucia covers it up to protect her daughter and then finds herself being blackmailed. Her husband is away on business. She has to handle it all on her own. I don't know. Is this the most precise portrait of domestic competence as entrapment? We have her
Well, yeah, good question. I think it's almost explicit in the movie. I mean, I would say there is this crime plot, right?
Yeah.
And leave it to the exceedingly charming blackmailer played by James Mason to tell her, you were a prisoner of your family. Can't you get away for one moment? So this is the mother who can't go to town to try to get the blackmail money because people would think it was weird that she used the car twice in the same week. This is the woman who can't tell her husband anything because everyone crowds around the phone when he makes a call. And of course, he's absent in a very, again, sort of a little bit referencing the war, but also kind of explicitly saying, that the paternal power that, the post-war period is really going to try to restore is highly in doubt. Yeah, he's a successful businessman, but she has to both, pick up the groceries and lift a dead body into an outboard motor and drive it into a swamp and dispose of it and just really hope she hasn't left her grocery list in the
right.
corpse. She's so relieved when she finds it in the pocket of her mink later. So I love this movie, and I'll just do a shout out to Todd Haynes, who in his movie Far From Heaven, and we've already had Leave Her to Heaven, and we're coming up on All That Heaven Allows. So, he's thinking about this set of films, really draws heavily on The Reckless Moment as well as All That Heaven Allows, which is much better known. And, incidentally, he also remade Mildred Pierce for HBO in a non-noir version, but that's also just as, it's all Oedipal issues around sexuality within the family. So this is about, can the mom have desire? And I feel like with The Reckless Moment, so I love it because Haynes loves it. And I think the reasons that we both love it are similar, is that it is about female fantasy. It is about what if this horrible life that I have that's perfect, I have beautiful children. They live in a very cool place, and I'm really emphasizing that these films are about showing new lifestyles to this little island near Los Angeles. That what if this sexy Irish blackmailer came into my life and really recognized my true worth as a woman. So it's like this little idol that happens. And of course it ends badly all around. But the second reason being that this is told by Max Ophüls. So the noir elements of this film, yes, blackmail, crime, are in the cinematography. There's a lot of location shooting. There's a lot of really incredible lighting that leads us to this woman is a prisoner of domesticity, of her role, of the middle-class white woman who is sort of both idealized and shown to be abjectly miserable. Like this, we have this overhead shot of her just sobbing on her bed, and then like having to like perk up to talk to her husband on the phone and, give him the banal details of their day. So the way the camera is handled, and Ophüls,
well known for his camera.
Yeah, especially for the mobile camera. So the mobility of the camera in relationship to the entrapment of the heroine is extremely poignant. And it's just, it plays so effectively. I was like, Leave Her to Heaven is like a hallucination. And this is like this kind of different kind of fever dream, just very compact, very like, did that really happen? It's all washed away. Like somehow the bodies of these men that die are kind of, yeah.
And she conveniently all fits into a puzzle for the police, so they can just check it off, right?
Goes away because she's not going to, she would be believed because she's this white woman. And then her kind of companion, who's the woman who her husband's gone, but she's a live-in black maid, Sybil, who, like Butterfly McQueen, there are some cringeworthy moments of, she calls her Mrs. I can't remember her name at the moment, but they like drive in a car together to kind of like catch the blackmailer. And you have this sense of, well, what if there were some kind of relationship between these women where they could kind of talk about like labor and possibilities and like what the hell's happening and changing in 1949 in the US. And it's just, you feel it, and you feel it from this. I was going to say, is this the first of our exile directors? And it isn't, because Cortese was also,
sure,
yeah.
Yeah.
But I feel with Ophüls, you really get what people will argue is a kind of European take on the promise of post-war America, which is that it ain't all that promising for many.
I want to go back to just talk about the absent husband, because I think that's such a fascinating element of this story, because it really is this, in some ways, it kind of plays as this structural joke, right? Like she's like, that's part of the trap, right? She's enabled, her competence is enabled because he's gone, but also everything that she does has to fit into the structure that he, and hence like society and everything, represents.
Let's call it patriarchy.
Yeah, right. She's managing all of this for somebody who's not even there. And I think that's a fascinating element of the story. And when James Mason kind of steps in loosely for that, it's like in some ways she wants him to fit, but knows also that that's just not something that can actually happen. Especially, I mean, he's like this working class criminal. Yeah,
we don't know what his partner has on him that keeps him in that
right
business.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's this kind of like daydream kind of whatever of like, what if it wasn't, I hate to use again this theory term, but the paternal signifier, like it is, there is no real, husband, because he's not shown on screen, and that her desire should end, when she's a mother. And I mean, and Mildred Pierce is highly transactional. Like she does get to like first fall in love with her, with Monty, and that's sexual, but that quickly becomes her writing him checks or proposing marriage to him so that, she could have an aristocratic last name, like very, very transactional, so that the problem of women's sexual desire after marriage, and which Leave Her to Heaven is all about, like she's always desirous, that the movie really does say the absent patriarchy is the determinative factor. And that, again, I think is reflected in the way the noir shadows in the house. We've got bars from the staircase, keeping her in prison. We have doors that are being, shut on her, on, certain aspects of their life. Her own father lives in the house, and he's emasculated to a certain extent. And her son is, always half dressed. So, there's something about his incomplete masculinity. And so, yeah, this idea that there is a masculine competence somewhere that could reflect Joan Bennett's is, undermined everywhere you look, or killed off in the case of Mason.
Yeah, it's Foster Hirsch, who was my guest for the noir episode last month. He had grouped this film in a group of noirs that he says where ordinary women are suddenly invaded by crisis. And I think that's an interesting way to look at this, because it does this, these first three films that we're talking about really do tie in nicely with the melodrama and the noir, right?
Absolutely.
And I think we're getting a lot of that here.
We are.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. All right, we're going to move to All That Heaven Allows. This is a big one. 1955, Douglas Sirk. We've moved through the cycle's first decade from the immediate post-war years into the early 50s, and now we hit the filmmaker who, more than anyone else, defined what this cycle looks like at its peak. Carrie Scott is a comfortable, widowed suburban woman who falls in love with Ron Kirby, her younger gardener. Her children disapprove. Her friends gossip. Her community makes clear that a relationship with someone of his social standing is unacceptable. The film is about whether she'll choose her own desire or the approval of everyone around her, and what either choice costs. This cycle's it's the most formally complete statement of this cycle, I think. Sirk using Technicolor, not as glamour, but really kind of as an argument. And I'm going to say, like, Technicolor in a way you don't see often. I mean, it's just exploding off of the screen in every frame. And it's so fascinating because you have beautiful surfaces everywhere, but they all feel suffocating. And you have this community as this entity that is really kind of like their gaze is the real antagonist of your story here.
That's right.
I mean, this is a powerful film with Sirk coding emotion into the image more than the dialogue, I'd even say. And I think that's such a fascinating element of Douglas Sirk throughout the films that he would make.
And I heard coating, coating, but I think it's that too. There's this coating over it, which is like, he's like, I used widescreen lenses and they made it seem hot. They make the surface seem hard and brittle, like they have a coating over them,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I'm just going to read a line from Tales of Sound and Fury, Observations on the Family Melodrama by Thomas Elsesser, 1972, which is the most ur text of kind of thinking of this as a cycle.
Sure, yeah.
He talks about the justification for giving critical importance to mise-en-scène over intellectual content or story value in these films. And then he says, it is also the reason, I don't know what the it refers to exactly, but back to your original question, that this is not a drama, this is a melodrama. Like, speech doesn't matter. What people say does not matter, right?
Okay, gotcha.
This is a justification for giving critical importance to mise-en-scène. It's also the reason why the domestic melodrama in color and widescreen, as it appeared in the 40s and 50s, is perhaps the most highly elaborated, complex mode of cinematic signification that the American cinema has ever produced, because of the restricted scope for external action determined by the subject, and because everything, as Douglas Sirk said, happens, quote unquote, inside. So I just wanted to get that quote in because, and actually I would give another quote about this film before we get into my response to the wonderful way you framed it. But it's Rainer Werner Fassbinder saying what he loves about Sirk's films. And he says, I love them because in Sirk's films, women think. You have the sense in All That Heaven Allows that Carrie, the Jane Wyman character, thinks.
Yeah.
And those two things kind of seem, well, I guess it's happening inside. But,
right.
Yeah. So this, of all the films, probably has one of, I haven't totally researched it, but has one of the least literary source material. Like it's a women's magazine story, right? And and so there's the sense that these movies look like, and they look like women's magazines, that they tell stories that you might find in women's magazines, like, oh my God, my daughter was involved with this guy and then I got blackmailed and he was sexy, whatever. And this one is, Rock Hudson is trimming my trees. And for some reason, wants to sweep me away from my absolutely impossible, perfectly upwardly mobile, college and post-college son and daughter to live in the pages of a women's magazine near Walden Pond, to have, whatever. Yeah. So what do we make of all of that? It is about the house, and about the house as trap, and about the way that I think you could also call this slightly noirish use of Technicolor, because there are a lot of very strong shadows in the film. And the color palette, like these like blues and yellows. And then there's literally a stained glass window in the family home that casts a color wheel on the bed where somebody is sobbing, which is just like the scene in Reckless Moment where a woman is sobbing in the bed. And, there's some element of the house that distances you from like, oh, I want to copy that cool thing, and instead lets you feel like you've entered into this psychodrama that, would be really hard to extricate yourself from. And that psychodrama is The Perfect American Family. So we have, again, absent husband, again, title that makes no sense, all that heaven allows. And you said the gaze of the
community's gaze, yeah.
Community's gaze, and specifically the club ladies and the middle class, upwardly mobile, very country club, very status conscious community is the antagonist. And when Fassbinder literally remakes this movie as Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, it couldn't be more explicit. There's all these shots of just people like lined up staring at what in his film is a interracial, like cross-generational and interracial couple. So a mismatched couple. In Sirk's film, it's simply Rock Hudson, who could not stare at Rock Hudson, matched with Jane Wyman. And she's older than he is, but like not much. So they're not as scandalously, mismatched, but they're scandalously mismatched because she's not supposed to have desire. And then there's also both retrospective, because we know that Rock Hudson was gay, but also I think perfectly possible at the time reading that Rock Hudson was gay or was not really in it was in it for something else. Do you know what I mean? Like there's something about, again, his woodenness as an actor, his size, the way he's positioned in the frame and dressed and, made to seem almost like a representative of hunky masculinity and not really someone who's you're not getting inside his head particularly, right?
Well, and it's a fascinating glimpse into a type of person also. And I think like what you're saying is like he doesn't seem to care, like he doesn't care where he fits in. And obviously we kind of meet, I don't want to call them bohemian, but it's just kind of like a group of carefree people who have no interest in making sure they fit in with the country club crowd, and that can just be free to enjoy themselves. And we meet somebody, the advertising friend, who had been in that circle and realized it was awful and he left. And so it is a community that they've kind of created, but it's too different from the other community that she's already part of. And I think, Rock Hudson is an interesting casting choice to play that bridge, because in so many ways he doesn't seem like the sort who should fit. But here he is. Like, it's interesting the way that he's written, because he's just like, he almost is like, the lover of the trees. Like he's this natural woodsman, but he seems almost too kind and caring to be like a real man in the country club sense.
Yeah. Yeah, he's kind of a mom. Like he's always like tying her boots, or you don't want your feet to get cold. So there's ways in which his desire is not like there's like one of the country club men makes it like yucky pass at her, and then another country club man who's really old says we should get married not for the sex but for the companionship, and
right, that's what everyone's pushing. That's okay.
And in fact, this movie, spoilers, because it's a melodrama, doesn't really let them be happy, even though it lets them be together. So the sex really like maybe happens. There's one fade, but my guess is that, she goes from what her daughter, whom I kind of love because she's studying Freud, and talks about the Oedipus complex.
It's so great, yeah. So 50s. That was just like perfect, yeah.
Yeah, with glasses on, but which she has to take off to kiss.
Yeah, of course.
And to go back to the house, which is where this all started, the daughter is trying to explain, desire to some, frat boy outside their family home. And they finally kiss underneath their mother's window, and the mother shuts the window. And it's so this very dramatic sense of, as you said, she's imprisoned in the house. Her face is reflected in the piano. She's shot repeatedly through windows that are like lit in blue. So she's just, almost like taxidermied in there. And then most dramatically, after everyone tells her she shouldn't marry this younger man, she should just get a television, she has been persuaded to give him up and is trapped, reflected in the television, on our widescreen screen.
Just to say, a gift from her children. Like as kind of a consolation prize for, well, you gave him up, so here's your TV.
Here's your TV. And the TV never gets turned on. And in Fassbinder's film, the son kicks the TV. And in Todd Haynes's remake of this movie, which also includes Reckless Moment and Ali Fear Eats the Soul, the husband is a television executive, and they pose as Mr. and Mrs. Magnavox. So let me try to turn rambling into a theme: displacement. There's displaced desire all over the place in this movie. And much has been made of the fact that, yes, the couple does get together, and a beautiful doe who is represented, almost like, that he is a pagan god, basically, Rock Hudson, and this doe follows him, is shown in their picture window. But he's injured, and like, she has to now take care of him. So the happy ending is not super happy. And that was something that Sirk insisted on, that irony being very, very visible to his viewers. So that displacement will always happen in his movies. I wanted to go back to something you said about the alternative community, because they do kind of start to appear in some of these films. So Minnelli's The Cobweb, it's actually set in a mental institution, but like there's an art teacher, and they make, so there is a sense that there should be a counterculture. Like this is also stifling. There's a literary reference to, let me try to say it right, Thoreau, that's what you're supposed to say, and Walden Pond. I was at Walden Pond last week, so I was just reminded that we all mispronounced that name.
Interesting, yeah.
And the fact that Sirk is like all the things that you mentioned about the color palette, the mise en scène that gets in the way. So he uses the same literal screen, like a decor screen. You see it both in Imitation of Life and in All That Heaven Allows. So it's like, let's pull it out, because I really like this idea of, people talking across furniture because they can't connect. Much is made of his literary background, theatrical background, his, intellectualness, so that he has an intellectual relationship to this material, and he is, in effect, critiquing Eisenhower American ideals. And I think this film pretty much holds up under that, argument, even though it's based on a magazine story, and even though there's a big takeaway, which is like, what if Rock Hudson, were my gardener. If, that's trivial in women's picture-y and all of that. So
Yeah, right.
to me, yeah, this is, maybe it's our middle film, but it's the one.
It's the big one. Yeah, right. Absolutely.
It's the big one that shows you what a woman's picture that's full on about her desire and the conflicts of her desire, how it looks different in the 50s than it would have in the 40s. And that is this kind of consumerist gloss and social hierarchy consciousness.
Well, and it's a fascinating glimpse into what we're going to see with Douglas Sirk. Let's move to Bigger Than Life, 1956, the second 1956 film, this one directed by Nicholas Ray. The cycle has largely centered on women navigating a world that constrains them. This next film really turns that inside out, putting the husband and father at the center and watching him become the source of danger inside the home that he is supposed to protect. Here we have Ed Avery, a mild-mannered schoolteacher in suburban America who's diagnosed with a painful arterial disease and prescribed cortisone, a then-new miracle drug. The drug works, but at high doses it begins to transform him. He becomes grandiose, tyrannical, and eventually delusional, convinced he's been chosen by God to purify his family. His wife and son are trapped in the house with a man they no longer recognize. This is an inversion of the cycle we've been talking about, and it's possibly the most disturbing one that we're looking at, where the home becomes a site of danger and not a source of refuge, and normalcy itself as kind of this mask that we're wearing that kind of falls off. And in an interesting way, a post-war, or it's a critique of the post-war masculine authority. And in some ways, there was one moment that stood out to me as man, there are some elements here that are frighteningly connected to modern day. And it's when he goes on his rant at the PTA meeting, and there's one dad afterward who's just
MAGA dad.
This is the guy. Yeah. I was like, this is the guy we should all be listening to. And it was like, wow, they were back then too. Crazy. Yeah.
No,
Wild
I had the
ride.
same reaction. I was like, oh my God,
Yeah.
Wow. No, yeah. So first, I guess I would say, what could you say after All That Heaven Allows? And so, I'm sorry, Written on the Wind. Is there any movie you can talk about after Written on the Wind? And I think it is probably bigger than life, because it true is, just again, a masterpiece, I think, of this genre. And then when you said the home itself is threatened, I just wanted to connect the staircases.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I just talked about the dad being kicked but falling down the stairs and dying. That is how he dies, just out of weariness and inability to control his nympho daughter and alcoholic son, and not have the son he wants, which is Rock Hudson. Everyone wants Rock Hudson. He is fully absent of all desire. And that's this incredible, winding staircase with a red, carpet, whatever.
That was
but
beautiful,
in Bigger Than Life, it's, they live in a tract house. They're in the Levittown, and things become very, very dark in this house. And the climax of the film is Walter Matthau, who's the gym teacher at the school where James Mason is the bow-tied, old-fashioned Mr. Chips guy, comes to rescue the family, and they tussle on the stairs and they break through the banister and fall down. And so Alcester, again, I think, talks about the staircases and the kind of rhythms of melodrama being super compressed, like the highs and the lows, the coincidence. And that's why the story, which was like a New Yorker story about somebody who
actually had something like this happen. Yeah.
Yeah. They become very compressed in the storytelling form of Hollywood film, and that the staircase is the perfect emblem for it, because people are not only the spaces of the house. So Jane Wyman is a prisoner up in her bedroom. The Reckless Moment mom is a prisoner up in her bedroom upstairs. And then these staircases are places where, people are having dramatic encounters, or just the whole thing falls apart. So yeah, I think that Bigger Than Life is this is the first one we've talked about with Nicholas Ray, but I think I mentioned him before. So, he's coming off of doing Rebel Without a Cause, which easily could be on this list, but it's just better known because it's the juvenile delinquent film. But
Right. Emasculated dad in that film for sure. Yeah.
Where's the Apron?
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
And the homes of two of the three, kids could be straight out of this genre. So Ray's interested in these themes, but he's also like bigger than life. Like he's making this kind of small story into this extremely like cosmic. The delusion that he gets is a biblical one that, he has to sacrifice his son, as did Abraham. But his wife's like, he didn't actually go through with it.
Yeah.
but James Mason, our charming blackmailer, and who produced the film, which I thought was interesting, is terrifying. I mean, and it has to do again with a very powerful voice. That his performance is really, I mean, he's able to go from like, I am this, bow tie wearing to work, and then I put on a cardigan and have a second job.
Very Mr. Rogers, yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Rogers, exactly. Second job dispatching taxis because this middle class lifestyle is completely unaffordable. We cannot do it. We can't buy the appliances we need. We can't go to the places that are represented on the posters on our walls in our little house, like they have, Venice.
Oh, yeah. All the Roman things everywhere, or the different things from Italy. Yeah.
Yeah. They want to go. Yeah. So the crisis of the patriarch shown this explicitly also supports this, perhaps exaggerated, but I kind of with it argument that these films are, while ostensibly, melodramas, are critiques of American culture.
I absolutely think that. And I think that's what's so fascinating because, I mean, in many ways, I mean, sure, we have this whole medical issue that he has, but I think a lot of it is also the cortisone really kind of becomes a metaphor because I don't think in some ways that Ed is just suddenly becoming this authoritarian figure. I think in some ways you're seeing like especially in that PTA scene and some of the things he's saying, I think a lot of it is probably already there. And this is just a tool that's amplifying it. And I think that's absolutely a critique of perhaps in some ways the way that the decade was overrun with wounded and depleted men who were striving to become a bigger representation of what a man is supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking here of Best Years of Our Lives, which, it's such an important movie where we probably shouldn't call it a domestic melodrama, but whoa, it's like three separate ones. But in that movie, the most high flying but also lowest class of the three servicemen who come back from the war and find it hard, played by Dana Andrews, has this incredible scene where he like goes back into like a junked fighter plane and realizes like it's junked and like the front of it's cut off, so it's like completely like ugh. And then he's kind of saved by the fact that he hears that all of the junked planes are each going to be turned into post-war housing. And so so I'm even thinking of these little homes as like, oh my God, this like version of masculinity that was called upon during the war and has now become the organization man, has become, the madman, ad man, whatever. They're now firmly in their little houses and they're like they're going crazy. And what are the political consequences of that going to be? And, Nick Ray is a, very outspoken leftist. And I think that that's pretty clear that bigger than life is probably, grandiosity, and that there is a national allegory there.
How do you read the ending where, Ed is subdued, he's kind of weaned from his drugs and everything, and the family's back together, but then the doctor's like, oh, he'll still have to take the drugs. It's just now you're going to be managing it better. Do you think, is there a happy ending that we have here?
Here's what I get there, and it is stolen, but also by Fassbinder, which I didn't even really realize till rewatching the movie. But he's like, "Oh yes, I recognize you're my son and you're my wife. This was important." There's this like red alarm light outside the clinic where he's recovering from his psychosis, and they're allowed to go into the psychosis recovery room, and they crawl in the hospital bed with him. So even though like on the level of like, so yes, he is still taking the drug, but the fact that the nuclear family is now like consigned to a hospital bed, that's where I read the ending of that movie.
Yeah. All right.
I think we need some social organization. I think we need some, maybe we need some, labor unions. I think we've seen more than this domestic space.
Yeah. Right. All right. We're going to take one more break and we'll be right back. All right. Let's move on to Home from the Hill, 1960, directed by Vincente Minnelli. The cycle has kind of moved through maternal sacrifice, suburban containment, family pathology, and the racial fault lines underneath the American dream. This next film stays in the domestic space, but moves the center of gravity from the women navigating the system to the man who built it.
Oof.
Wade Honeycutt is a wealthy, philandering Southern patriarch whose iron grip on his family is the organizing force of the entire community around him. His legitimate son, Theron, is raised under his thumb, trained to be a man in his image. Rafe, his illegitimate son, is kept at the margins, acknowledged informally but denied everything formal. When both young men fall for the same woman, and when the weight of Wade's history starts to collapse, the film reveals how thoroughly one man's myth of masculinity has poisoned everyone around him. I mean, Robert Mitchum, I've always loved. We talked about him a lot in the film noir, but watching him in this film, I'm like, this is a great next step for him to kind of continue and move into this space. I mean, wow.
Like to open the door to the den and all of a sudden it's in color, because all those noir movies, he's so fierce and scary, and he's still fierce and scary, but like, let's just talk about the den. We know this is the den. So he has this bastion of masculinity, which is like deep blood red accents. And Minnelli does red like no one does red. And I'm thinking across his musicals and his melodramas here.
Sure, yeah.
A rack of guns on the walls, like boars' heads. I mean, wild boars in a yellow swamp are like part of the mise en scène of this movie. Like this movie is really... we just keep topping over the topping. Yeah, right. Yeah, just these taxiderming heads. So he has this manly den. Right. And then, we were talking about how the father in the other Southern melodrama. Oh, and this one. No, I forgot to say that Written on the Wind, there is actually a crime. There is like a whole like Southern crime, like a tobacco farmer crime real life story behind that was, which was interesting to find. After years of teaching it, I kind of delved a little bit more into it. Yeah, this one is the opposite, right? He is the big man. Like we finally meet the man that was missing from all the other films. Like the dad is dead, he's ashes and leave her to heaven. He's at the other end of the phone line. We're not really entirely sure he exists, but in Reckless Moment, Bigger Than Life, the contrast is clear, but this is like an actual big man. Yeah, he's right. Like in Written on the Wind, he's a small man. Yeah, Written on the Wind, he's a small man. Yeah. And this guy's a big man like Rock Hudson, but he's an actor and not a model. And I mean, not that I do love Rock Hudson I think he's got great comic timing, and I'm not to say, but I think he's directed. I think both Lana Turner, this isn't my aside, and Rock Hudson are directed to be wooden in the Sirk movies. And I think that's good. Anyway, yeah. So here we see him, and I think the tragedy is with the son. The tragedy is with the son who's being forced, who's played by George Hamilton, Theron, who's clearly, he is a mama's boy. I mean, she makes him warm milk like how many times in that movie? Mom withholds sex from her husband. He finds it elsewhere. I think that it's not gay, but it's kind of gay. Like, I mean, I do think the Theron and his relationship with his half brother, the bastard son, George Peppard, who, really does want to acknowledge his kinship. There's a thing going on around possible forms of masculinity that could be possibly emerging around 1960, that could be queer, and that just Robert Mitchum is around to make sure that does not happen. And so in the movie, it's, the George Hamilton character does have to have a sexual initiation, but like he's always wearing like these white jean outfits that, I don't know, he's just cute in this way that is very like not, it is another form of masculinity. And so the pathos is about, could that emerge?
Well, and it's an interesting glimpse into the world of the family at this time, especially through these post-war domestic melodramas where in many ways we've been focused on the mother, and here the mother has specifically cut a deal, we'll just say, essentially with Wade to say, I will stay with you because you're going to give me control to raise our son. Now, first of all, how do you even get to that place where you need to make that decision? Like already this well of this relationship has been poisoned, right? Wade is already a toxic, just, pollutant in everything that he touches. And we're seeing it right here, which had to have been before they even had the kid, right? And then like through all of this, like, and she's poisoned, so she's pushing their son to be raised a certain way, and all of that shifts at this point when we come into the film, when he's recognizing that people look at me wrong, and why have you not trained me to be the hunter that you are? I'm your son, and all of a sudden everything starts changing, and I just think like that's when the poisoning really starts shifting from poisoning the wife to poisoning the son, and turning him into another monstrous version of what he had been.
Yeah, no, I think that's really right. And so that we've got to this point of the family's completely disintegrated, right? Like, it's like they're not even pretending to lie in the same hospital bed together. Like they all have separate rooms. I mean, and again, leave it to Minnelli to have like really separate rooms, like the decor that matches each character's, whatever gestalt is so perfect and over the top.
And they're really like when they go to someone else's space, like they come into the doorway and the other person is like at the far end. Like it's a long hallway to get to that space. Like they really separate the spaces here.
Yeah. I mean, and so I would say for Minnelli, like I've talked about color and mise-en-scène, but we really do want to talk about his use of space and his use of mobile camera is really, I think, important because he's making so like we started out talking about these arguments about characterization, but also about like the possibilities of repair through, camera distance. And I was thinking a little bit about Giant, which you kind of can't not think about, I suppose. And if you're thinking about like Home from the Hill and Written on the Wind, I mean, Written on the Wind is just so tight, but this one sprawls a little bit.
Definitely more epic. I mean, close to, it was like 2.5, 3 hours somewhere in there.
And doesn't need to be, except for it. I mean, in the sense that it's still very focused on this kind of small family, kind of allegory. The mom, I want to say a little bit more about. I love Eleanor Parker. She's so weird. Her performance is so weird in this film in a kind of great way. Like she looks like she's on Valium. I mean, she's
right. Interesting.
Doing this kind of drawl that's very kind of otherworldly. She's enacting these kind of post-war, like, I mean, God, we've already had the feminine mystique is written the year before. So we're really seeing this kind of, she gets her moments of explosive like desire, but her desire is for her son, which is misdirected. But I do feel for her. And then we have the sexy women who are, the lusty women who are probably, I think, representing a little bit of the cusp of, sexual revolution happening, because it's coming in a way more from them than from Theron.
Right. Like, and I think Libby is a good representation of that for the young men, right? Right. She also feels very, just to kind of like go back to like the Disney side of her, like she's very fun and fancy free. That's kind of like the world that she comes from, just very light. And I think that plays well into this era and these stories, and feels very different from Eleanor. And using her, I think I just want to get a sense from you, because Rafe, we haven't really talked too much about Rafe, but such an important character in the story. And George Peppard, I thought, was fantastic, and really the most sympathetic character in the whole film. And I'm curious, like, how do you read his position in the film? Is our sympathy like a critique of the legitimacy, or is it like ultimately kind of reinforcing all of the questions that we have about him and his relationship with his dad and Eleanor?
Yeah, I think we're with him. And I think that we're with him in we're talking about a little bit in the other Minnelli film with Bad and the Beautiful, which is that there's this way in which his sensitive men, and this isn't the sensitive son per se, but he really is, that they have a kind of emotional truth to them. I mean, I feel like the struggle, I don't know. Yeah. I think Rafe is, what a name, right? Rafe and Theron. It's like, you're not telling us anything here. No, I think the film is happy with him being illegitimate. Like, what is legitimacy?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that's interesting, especially with the ending that we get with him now taking on the father role for his brother's child, and the grave and everything. Like, it feels like it's trying to find a way to make it legitimized, and I think that's interesting.
Which I guess we should think of as a shift. I think we should think of it not as a reinscription of like, oh, let's just pretend. Yes, it is an acknowledgement, and he gets to be part of the he gets to be seen by her and as real. But I think what we are seeing is an acknowledgement of a generational shift to a new kind, and that dad moves into this appropriately ridiculous gravestone, which I guess I'll just call back to, there's this really hilarious moment in Written on the Wind where All That Heaven Allows, where the son, who's like a total cad, who's only good for making martinis and criticizing his mother, it refers to some like thing that's on the mantle that basically represents dad, right?
The
and
big trophy,
trophy that that they drink from or something, and that he says, "This, we can't get rid of that. Why'd you put that away? It's been in the family I don't know how long." So it just kind of says, like, why do we invest in these traditions? So I think Home from the Hill has this kind of fun way in ending with this, like, we're investing in this ridiculous thing because we've been able to turn his patriarchal vitriol into a thing, one that's perfectly big on screen.
Suits him.
Yeah, Minnelli knows how to do that, but that we are going to understand generational legacy and what masculinity could be. And I'm thinking of Tea and Sympathies coming. I'm not sure sequencing when it comes in.
We're not talking about that one. We've got children's.
No, but I'm just thinking about
time-wise.
We're getting there. But just when it's made, that you could, that there, that there's much more explicit ways of talking about other forms of masculinity. And yeah, I guess it's a little reinscribing the nuclear family at the end. But it is, and whatever, what Giant does it too. It's like, let's have these Mexican kids as part of our family. I mean, they try to put it all back in the family. I guess that's something I could say and haven't said. Melodrama takes everything that's political and puts it in the family, right? That's both good because there's politics in the family and we all know that and we don't say it enough. It's also bad because the way it looks in the family is not like legible as politics and you can't put it all there.
Yeah, right.
Especially not just white families, yeah.
That's actually an interesting way of looking at a lot of these films. I can see that through a number of them, so.
Like the conflicts are intractable because they are in the world out there. And these relationships they're all symbolizing them,
Which, speaks to the internal way that, inside the house, the internal feelings, all of that kind of like ties into the whole idea of the domestic melodrama. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Patricia. Just like so many amazing films and such rich depth through all of them. And just as a note, like going from here, we've already talked so much about like the legacy of this, as far as like the soap operas and the primetime melodramas that we had. And you mentioned Rainer Werner Fassbinder and Todd Haynes as a couple things. We also had, coming out of this in the 70s and 80s, a real growth of kind of the feminist film theory legacy with Laura Mulvey and Linda Williams and all these other people. And so I just think that it's important to discuss in this post-war period.
So this one, Home is Where the Heart Is, Studies on Melodrama and the Women's Picture, edited by Christine Gledhill, is kind of a great anthology. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, there's another one we'll make sure we include. But thank you so much for being here and being part of this conversation, because I think it's a rich period, and in the scope of everything we're looking at, this mini-series I've been doing with the post-war, it's an important one. And I think it's very key to look at like what was going on in the home at this time. And these films are full of so much rich storytelling in that regard.
Yeah, it's the consumerist, explosion, and you're going to see it on the screens that represent, the places where people bought all the stuff that they were being told to buy. And that's different from some of the other, So a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Do you have plugs? Any? I know you've got a couple books that you have, and you already mentioned you are on Instagram. Like, do you want to?
I'm not really on Instagram.
Oh, okay.
I am. It's P White Philly. I would like to be more. I'm of a generation of whatever. But
yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, no. I'm going to the Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference next week, and that'll be fun. They're going to interview me about like my trajectory through film studies. So I was
Fantastic.
Thinking of, and they collect those interviews with various people in the field.
Oh, good.
Who entered it at different times and, found different pathways. So, yeah.
Well, I'll put links for your books and everything else in the show notes. Again, Patricia, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Next month, we're staying in the post-war aftershock, but the pressure moves from the private to the political. Where domestic melodrama traps anxiety inside the home, the next cycle takes the same dread and relocates it into institutions, secrecy, and the state itself. Next month, we're looking at post-war paranoia thrillers. Thanks for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Network. Music by Orcus and Roy Spiegler. Find us and the entire Next Reel family of film shows at truestory.fm. Follow at The Next Reel on social media, and if you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and review wherever you listen. As we part ways, remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious.